to invite you to join with me as we kind of travel back in time. I invite you to step back in time to the Old Testament with me, and we're going to join up with a servant of God, a prophet of God named Elijah. Elijah had just done battle with all of the prophets of the false god Baal, and one of the false prophets of Baal, he goes to the Queen Jezebel, and he shares with her what's happened, and Jezebel becomes angry, and this is where we meet up with him. So I'm going to invite you to join me in 1 Kings chapter 19, and we're going to read verses 1 through 9. When Ahab got home, he told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done, including the way he had killed all of the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent this message to Elijah: "May the gods strike me and even kill me if by this time tomorrow I have not killed you just as you killed them." Elijah was afraid, and he fled for his life. He went to Beersheba, a town in Judah, and he left his servant there. Then he went on alone into the wilderness, traveling all day. He sat down under a solitary broom tree and prayed that he might die. "I've had enough, Lord," he said. "Take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors who have already died." Then he lay down, and he slept under the broom tree. But as he was sleeping, an angel touched him and told him, "Get up and eat." He looked around, and there beside his head was some bread baked on hot stones and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord came to him again and touched him and said, "Get up and eat some more, or the journey ahead will be too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank, and the food gave him enough strength to travel for 40 days and 40 nights to Mount Sinai, the mountain of God. There he came to a cave where he spent the night. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So Elijah had just defeated the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, and essentially what was a contest to see whose God was the one true God. And of course, Yahweh wins. The one true God, the God of Israel, wins. Elijah had prayed, and Yahweh answered by sending fire to light the sacrifices on the altars that had been watered down. They set those sacrifices and those altars on fire. God did when Elijah prayed, and he answered. And now Elijah is tired and perhaps exhausted. And perhaps Elijah is experiencing his own dog days of summer. Jezebel, the queen, finds out, and instead of bowing down to the one true God, once she learns that her false prophets have been defeated, she instead chooses to threaten Elijah and make attempts to kill him. So Elijah runs. Now, we're not sure, according to most commentators, if Elijah ran on his own accord or because God told him to, although most suppose that since it's not written in Scripture that God instructed him to, that Elijah probably ran of his own accord. And here Elijah is in his own dog days of summer. He's run to Beersheba, and in Beersheba he leaves a servant in the town, and he goes out into the wilderness, and in the wilderness he sits down under a solitary, all alone, tree, a broom tree. Now, a broom tree is a tree or a shrub found in that climate that would grow to be an average of about 10 feet tall. So it was probably about the perfect height for him to sit down under and have shade to shade him from the elements of the climate that he was in and the area he was in. And this is where we join up with Elijah. We join up with him when perhaps he's in the midst of his own dog days of summer, exhausted emotionally and spiritually and physically. Remember a couple of weeks ago how Pastor Deborah described the dog days of summer? Those hot, sticky days where you're just exhausted, where the heat just zaps you of all of your energy and you feel cracked and dry and parched. And oh, what you wouldn't do to long for a cold, thirsty drink. Well, spiritually, seems as though we're meeting up with Elijah when he's in the midst of his own dog days of summer. He is exhausted emotionally and spiritually and physically. He is parched and dry and cracked and exhausted. How many of us have been there? I don't know about you guys, but I have experienced some dog days of summer. So Elijah sits down under this broom tree and he falls asleep. And while he is sleeping, an angel of Yahweh comes to him and wakes him. The angel provides him with food and water and tells him to eat. And once again, Elijah falls asleep. And once again, the angel of Yahweh comes to him and says, "Hey, wake up. Eat some more, drink some more, or the journey that God has called you to will be too much for you." So the angel provides him with the food and water to drink so that he can be prepared for his journey God is going to send him on. And Elijah eats and drinks, and now well rested and hydrated and sustained and nourished, he takes off on a 40-day journey to Mount Sinai. Well, there are some important lessons that we can learn from Elijah in this instance. Some important lessons that can transfer from Elijah in his dog days of summer to us in our dog days of summer spiritually. The first is this: we cannot do it of our own accord. It's supposed that Elijah ran on his own accord, that he didn't follow God. Now, this is interesting. Elijah, who had just prayed, and in his prayer, he had called down fire from heaven, and God sent fire from heaven to light on fire these sacrifices that had been watered down, right? Elijah, who had beat the false prophets, who had truly proven that his God was the one true God, just by prayer alone. He's threatened, and instead of stopping and praying, instead of calling on the strength and the power of God, what does he do? He takes things into his own hands, and he runs on his own. And so the first thing we learn here is that that's not to say that spiritual battles can't be invigorating, but also sometimes when you've done battle spiritually, it can be exhausting. I don't know if any of you have ever had a situation where you've done battle spiritually, right? You've gone to the Lord in prayer for something, you have spoken words of truth in a situation, and you leave and you are exhausted from the work. Elijah was exhausted. He was exhausted, and he was so exhausted that he actually told God that he wanted to die. He'd had enough. He just was like, enough is enough. I'm done, God. And now, again, I don't know, I'm not saying that any of us have ever asked God if we could just die, but I'm sure plenty of us have said, enough is enough, God. I've had enough and I am done. I know some of our parishioners are probably feeling like that right now with their own life situations. Enough is enough, God. I am done. And he was exhausted. And do you know what he did? He napped. He laid down under the broom tree and he napped. In that time, when Elijah was exhausted, God blessed him with a nap. He provided him with rest. There is great need in the dog days of summer for both spiritual and emotional and physical rest. Resting not in our own abilities, but in God. This is what we've talked about previously when it's come to Sabbath, right? That when we Sabbath, we are able to rest in God because we trust that God is in control. That the work that needs to be done, God will take care of. And so we can truly just sit still in his presence and rest in him. St. Augustine put it this way: you have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. Essentially, any rest that we try to seek on our own until it's found in God will be pointless. We will be restless. We will be unable to truly rest until we rest in God's presence. All seeking of rest and restoration is vain unless first our souls rest in Christ. When we find our spiritual rest in him, he is able to provide for our physical and emotional rest in a way that actually restores, rejuvenates, and reignites us for Christ. I've told this story before, but I'm going to tell it again because it fits so well today. Several years ago, my family went on vacation to Florida, to my mom's timeshare down in Florida, and Pastor Deborah and Pastor Matt and Eleanor was just a little one. She was just learning to walk. We drove down, and we met my sister and her family down there, and we had a great time, and it was fun. But how many of you have ever had a vacation that's fun, but it's not necessarily relaxing? It's not necessarily rejuvenating, right? Every day was, yeah, right, everyone's raising their hands. If you have kids, you really know that that's the truth, right? Every day was a different place to go. It was constantly on the go, right? And we left, and I had fun, but I didn't feel rejuvenated. And it was during a time in life where I was feeling particularly parched spiritually. Does that make sense? I was feeling particularly tired and exhausted spiritually. And on our way back up to Michigan from Florida, we stopped in Georgia, and we stopped in the Golden Isles. Specifically, we stopped in Jackal Isle, and we got a hotel there. And when we drove in, it was sunset, and it was a beautiful sunset over the waterways. It was gorgeous. And we got the hotel, and we checked in, and it was dark, and we went to bed. And the next morning, I woke up, and Eleanor was still sleeping, and my mom was still sleeping, and Matt was still sleeping, and it was quite early. But when I say I woke up, I don't know how to tell you I was exhausted, but I woke up. And I couldn't go back to sleep. And I just decided to go for a walk. And so I slipped on a hoodie, and I slipped on some sandals, and I walked out, and I followed this little pathway, and this little pathway took me over some dunes and onto the beach. And I walked up and down that beach as the sun rose. Now, if you know me, I'm not one who wakes up for the sunrise very often. I'm more of a sunset kind of girl. That's just my personality. I'll do sunrises, but it's not my go-to. And I walked that path, and as I walked that path, I looked down and I noticed sand dollars coming up in the water. And there was some kind of tide that had brought in the beach was just covered in sand dollars. And as I watched the sun rise over the ocean, I swooped down and I picked up those sand dollars and I held them in my hands and I put the ones that were alive back in the water and I collected the ones that weren't. And I don't know how to explain this because nothing magical happened in that moment. I didn't have any big epiphany, but in that moment I felt the presence of the Lord. And in that moment, it was like a balm to my soul. I don't know if you've had those moments where my soul was parched and cracked and dry, and it was like God handed me a big glass of ice water to quench my spiritual thirst. And I felt so connected with God in that moment. In fact, I've often told my mom that every vacation I go on, I try to recreate that moment because it was such a good moment for my soul where God just restored me, where I had been restless and I found my rest in Him. Finding emotional, spiritual, and physical rest is an important and key part to surviving the dog days of summer. The second thing that we learn from Elijah is that we must rely on God to sustain us. We must rely on God to sustain us. Elijah tried his own way, right? I said that earlier. He tried his own way, and he couldn't be sustained on his own. It was only the angel of the Lord who could sustain him. In fact, at first he ate and drank, and then he went back to sleep, and guess what the angel said? Hey, that's not enough. God has called you to this awesome journey, this awesome adventure, and you must be sustained. Eat and drink some more. I think about it like this. When I had Eleanor and now again with Jensen relies fully on Matt and I to sustain him. Every need that Jensen has is fulfilled simply by his parents, right? Jensen can't feed himself. As a little baby, he can't change his diaper, right? He can't even, right now, he can't even move, though he's trying to start to scooch, from one place to another. If he wants to go somewhere, he relies on us to take him from one place to another. He relies on us to provide him for his nourishment and his sustenance, to clean him, to keep him bathed, to put him to sleep at night, to get him up in the morning. He is fully reliant on us. In the same way, we need to be fully reliant on God. When we try to sustain ourselves with the things of the world, we will find that we are not sustained. We will find that we are not full, that we are not satiated and satisfied, because our full reliance as Christians must be on God to sustain us. We must rely on God to sustain us. Physically, spiritually, and emotionally, Elijah was depleted and he was ready to die. And then God sent an angel to provide exactly what Elijah needed. God provided twofold. He provided food and water for Elijah so that Elijah was nourished and hydrated. He provided spiritually for Elijah. He said, hey, the journey ahead is 40 days and 40 nights. So he offered him a time of rest under that tree, right? He allowed him to sleep, and perhaps since it says it was a solitary broom tree, God may have even just provided that tree alone. We don't know for sure, but maybe that one tree was the shade provided to shade Elijah so he could nap. So he provided emotionally, parched and cracked and dry. We must recognize our full need for reliance on God. So how does God sustain us? We are sustained physically when we treat our bodies as the temple of God that they are. When we eat healthy and in a way that nourishes our bodies so that we have physical energy and strength to complete the journey that God has called us to. It's not always easy. No, I'm not saying you can't enjoy some ice cream from time to time. I have been known to enjoy some ice cream from time to time. I'm not saying that you can't, enjoy a burger from time to time. I'm not saying you only have to eat a salad. But what I am saying is that when we treat our bodies like the temple of God that they are, by nourishing them with healthy foods, by exercising, we're able to be sustained physically. We are sustained emotionally when we nourish in Scripture, His words in psalms and hymns and songs, and through time spent with the body of believers. Have you ever left a time of worship feeling spiritually nourished? I know I have. There have been times where I've left time, whether it be through the music or the preaching of the word or prayer, or perhaps through just interaction with other members of the body of believers, where I have left feeling nourished, feeling rested, restored, rejuvenated, and sustained. It's not just that time on Sundays that sustains us, though. We need to be in his word daily so that we can be sustained throughout the entire week. If we only ate on Sundays, guys, we wouldn't be sustained throughout the week, right? We have to eat. The Lord has spoken directly to my soul. When in prayer, I have felt his presence near me. When in worship, I have literally felt the descending of the Spirit on me. When in communicating with other body of believers, I have been held accountable, I have been lifted up, and I have been encouraged and sustained. This nourishment is God's food for our spiritual self. When we rely fully on God to sustain us, we find out that we not only survive the dog days of summer, but we thrive in them, and we are